The file landed on the table with a sound like a gunshot. Nobody in the room flinched. That was the thing about the 3rd Special Forces Group briefing room at Fort Bragg. You learned early that flinching cost you something, even if you couldn't name exactly what. Sergeant Major Doherty stood at the head of the table, both hands flat on the surface, and looked at the woman sitting at the far end like he was trying to decide something he'd already decided 3 days ago. "Staff Sergeant Mercer," he said, "tell me you can read a topographic map." She didn't look up from the file she'd already opened. "Better than most people in this room, Sergeant Major." The silence that followed had texture to it, the kind that comes when something lands wrong and everyone is waiting to see who moves first. Lena Mercer had joined the Army at 19 because there was nothing left in Sudbury, Ontario, that wanted her the way she wanted it. She had crossed into the States on a work visa, then a student visa, then a citizenship application that took 4 years and cost her more paperwork than she thought a human life could generate. By the time she raised her right hand and swore the oath, she was 23 and had already been shooting competitively for 6 years. Rifles, mostly. Long range. She had a particular stillness when she looked through a scope that her first coach, a retired Mountie named Aldrich, had called unnatural. "I don't mean that badly," Aldrich had said, watching her breathe before a shot, the way a person breathes before sleep. "I mean, there's something in you that goes quiet when everything else gets loud." She'd thought about that for a long time. By the time she made it through Ranger School, one of only a handful of women to do so in the class of her year, she understood what Aldrich had meant. Not as a compliment exactly. As a description of something that set her apart in ways that weren't always welcome. The unit she'd been assigned to out of selection was Operational Detachment Alpha 324. 12 men and 1 woman, and the men had not been quiet about their opinions on that distribution. Not all of them. That was important to understand. Sergeant Oyalaran to understand. Sergeant Oyalaran said nothing that first week, just handed her toward the gear locker like she'd been there for years. Captain Aldgate ran her through the same qualification standards as everyone else without editorializing. Warrant Officer Jesper gave her the same grunt of acknowledgement he apparently gave everyone. But there were others. Truscott was the loudest. He was a big man from somewhere in rural Pennsylvania who had the specific confidence of someone who'd never been in a room where his size didn't settle most arguments. He didn't say anything directly to Mercer for the first 2 weeks. He said things adjacent to her, to Oyalaran, to the team's medic Farquhar, to anyone within earshot, comments about weight limits and whether the exfil bird could carry extra personnel, questions about whether the training standards had changed or whether certain people had gotten creative accommodations. Mercer heard every word. She had the stillness for it. The thing people misunderstood about being the only woman in a room full of men who weren't sure they wanted you there. They expected you to either fight it or cry about it. What they didn't expect was patience, real patience, the kind that has roots in it. She'd learned patience the same place she learned to shoot, from her grandfather, a Finnish-Canadian trapper who believed that most problems solved themselves if you waited long enough without blinking. She waited. The qualification range was outside Fayetteville, in the flat Carolina heat of early September. The team ran through the standard course first, moving targets, dynamic entry scenarios, stress shoots. Mercer finished in the middle of the pack, just ahead of Farquhar and just behind Jesper, which was where she'd expected to finish because those were the areas where upper body mass mattered, and she'd always been honest with herself about that. Then they moved to the long-range station. The targets were set at distances ranging from 400 meters to 1,100 meters. A crosswind had come up from the southeast. The range officer, a lean man named Sergeant Wickfield, called the conditions and let the team sort themselves out. Truscott went first and hit 7 of 10 at the final distance, which was genuinely good. He knew it. And he looked at Mercer after he stepped back from the firing position, with the specific expression of a man who wants you to understand something without him having to say it. Mercer stepped up. She took 45 seconds on the first target, longer than anyone else on the team, long enough that she could feel the quality of the silence changing behind her. She wasn't reading the wind flags. She was watching the grass at the base of the target, the way it moved in small, inconsistent pulses that told a different story than the flags did. She adjusted 3 clicks right. She exhaled the way Aldrich had taught her, the slow release that left nothing held back, and she fired. The round hit. She didn't look behind her. She moved to the next target. 10 shots. 10 hits. including the final position at 100 meters, where the wind had shifted just enough in the last 5 seconds that she'd had to make a decision with incomplete information and had made the right one. Wickfield called the score and said nothing else. Truscott said nothing, but the silence now was a different shape than it had been. The mission brief came 6 weeks later. A joint operation with Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, CANSOFCOM, which was unusual enough that half the team raised an eyebrow. The target was a facilitator operating through a supply network that moved material across a mountainous border region. The terrain was a problem. The altitude was a problem. The timeline was, in Captain Aldgate's words, aggressive in a way that makes me want to drink. 3 CSOR operators would be attached to the team for the operation. One of them, when they walked into the briefing room at 0500 on a Thursday, was a woman, Master Corporal Beliveau. 5'6", dark hair pulled back without ceremony, the kind of posture that comes from years of ruck marches rather than anything conscious. She shook hands around the room with the efficiency of someone who had better things to do, then looked at Mercer and something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of a shared mathematical problem. "You the long-range shooter?" Beliveau asked. "One of them," Mercer said. Beliveau nodded, like that was the right answer, and moved on. Truscott watched this exchange from across the room. Later, when Mercer was checking her kit, she heard him tell Farquhar that apparently they were running a daycare now. Farquhar didn't laugh, which was something, but he didn't say anything either. The operation was designated Thunderline. The insert was by helo to a ridge position 12 kilometers from the objective, then a movement on foot through terrain that the mission planners had described as challenging, because they were optimists or they'd never walked it personally. It was more than challenging. It was the kind of ground that reminded you your body was a machine with a finite number of operating hours, and you were spending them now. The team moved at night. Mercer carried her rifle, her sidearm, her kit, and 112 pounds of total load that pressed on her the same way it pressed on everyone else. Truscott was ahead of her in the file and set a pace that she suspected was deliberate, slightly too fast for anything except proof. She matched it without comment. At the third rest stop, Beliveau moved up beside her and handed her a piece of hard candy without explanation. Mercer took it. "So run their selection different from yours?" Mercer asked. "Different enough," Beliveau said. "Same enough." She paused. "You shoot better than your file says? My file undersells me? Most of ours do." They moved again before first light into a river valley that smelled of pine and something mineral and cold. The altitude was doing things to everyone's breathing. By the time they reached the observation position, Truscott was moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who wouldn't admit he was managing something, and Mercer was breathing steady. She set up the rifle without being told. Aldgate had assigned her the Overwatch role, which was either respect for her qualification score or tactical logic or both. She found the objective building through the scope and began building her understanding of it the way she always did. Slowly, without forcing conclusions. The building was a converted grain storage facility, 2 stories, with a vehicle parked at the northeast corner and foot traffic suggesting between 8 and 12 personnel inside. She noted a guard rotation, approximate 8 minutes, with a gap on the south approach that lasted about 90 seconds. She reported all of this to Aldgate in a low, even voice. He listened and made adjustments to the plan, without acknowledging that the plan now looked significantly like what she'd described. The breach was supposed to happen at 0340. At 0312, the vehicle at the northeast corner started its engine. Things happened quickly after that. The vehicle moved to the south approach, directly into the path of the breaching element, which was not yet in position. Aldgate called the abort. The breaching element started to pull back. A guard who was either early or had heard something, came around the corner of the building at speed, and the situation went from a controlled abort to a contact faster than anyone had planned for. Mercer heard it in her earpiece before she saw it in the scope. She was already adjusting when Aldgate said, "Overwatch, we have," and she fired. The round removed the threat. She was already moving to the next sector. What followed was 11 minutes that she would later be unable to fully reconstruct in sequence, because that was how contact worked. It compressed and stretched time simultaneously, and memory came back in fragments rather than narrative. She fired 6 more times in those 11 minutes. 4 of those shots were at distances and angles that the after-action report would later describe as outside standard parameters. She knew, even as she was making them, that she was operating in the space beyond what training covered, the space where you either had something in you that worked or you didn't. She had it. Belivo's element got the objective package, a hard drive and 2 cellular devices, from the building, while Oyalaran and Jesper held the outer perimeter, and Mercer held everything that moved on the north and east approaches. When the helo extract came in, everyone was accounted for. Everyone. Truscott had taken a round through the upper arm during the breach contact. Not life-threatening, but bad enough that Farquhar spent the entire exfil with his hands inside the wound and a look on his face that meant he was using all his focus to keep it that way. Truscott was conscious and quiet, in a way he'd never been quiet before, and he looked at the ceiling of the helicopter rather than at the people around him. Mercer sat across from him. She watched him the way she watched everything, without forcing it. At one point, he turned his head and looked at her directly for maybe the first time in 6 weeks. She didn't say anything. Neither did he, but something shifted in the geometry of it. She could feel it the same way she could feel a wind change through a scope, as information, not as resolution. The debrief was 2 days later. The Seesaw element had already returned to Canada. Captain Aldgate ran through the operational timeline, the assessment of the objective package, the follow-on intelligence value. When he reached the contact at 0312, he went through it methodically, the way he went through everything. Then Colonel Ashworth walked in. Ashworth commanded the group. He was not a man who walked into team debriefs on operational details unless he had a specific reason to be there. He was 60 years old, thin in the way that serious runners get thin, with the kind of face that had stopped doing anything unnecessary around the time he made major. He pulled a chair from the side of the room and sat down without being invited, which was the kind of thing he could do because he was a colonel. He listened to the remainder of the debrief without speaking. When Aldgate finished, Ashworth looked at the room for a long moment. His eyes moved from face to face and landed on Mercer the way they'd landed on everyone else. No longer, no differently. I reviewed the Overwatch report, he said. All 7 engagements. The shot at the northwest corner at 031A, walk me through that. The room was completely still. Mercer described the shot. The target had been at approximately 340 meters, moving, partially obscured by the corner of the building, with a fellow team member in the adjacent sector. She'd had a window of approximately 1.5 seconds, and the angle had required her to account for the partial obstruction while avoiding the sector line. She described it in the same even voice she used for everything, because that was how she processed things, out loud and factually, without decoration. Ashworth listened to all of it. That shot saved Sergeant Oyalaran, he said when she finished. The room stayed still. I've been doing this for 32 years, Ashworth said. He wasn't looking at Mercer anymore. He was looking at the room, at all of it. I have seen maybe 6 or 7 people in my career who could make that shot under those conditions. I want that on record. I want everyone in this room to understand what they were standing next to on that ridgeline. He stood up. Staff Sergeant Mercer, he said, and now he was looking at her directly. I expect to see your name on the advanced sniper course roster by end of month. That is not a suggestion. He left the room the same way he'd entered it. Later, after the rest of the team had filed out, Truscott stopped at the doorway. Mercer was gathering her notes from the table. She heard him stop and she waited without turning around, the way she'd learned to wait, without pressure. That shot at the northwest corner, Truscott said. She turned. His arm was in a sling. He looked like a man working through something in real time, the words coming out with some difficulty, like cargo that had been loaded wrong and needed adjusting mid-transit. I didn't see the angle, he said. From where I was, I didn't understand what you were working with. She waited. I looked at the report, he said. What you had. The sector line, Oyalaran's position. He stopped. I don't know if I could have made that shot. It was as honest a thing as she'd heard him say. She understood. You might have, she said. Different shooters, different approaches. He looked at her for a second, and she saw him almost say something, and then decide not to, and that was probably the right call for now. He nodded and left. She stood alone in the briefing room for a moment. The chair where Ashworth had sat was slightly askew from the table. Outside, she could hear voices in the hallway, the ordinary sounds of a team resettling after something that had required everything. She straightened the chair, then she picked up her notes and walked out. The advanced sniper course roster closed on a Friday. Her name was on it. So was Oyalaran's. When Oyalaran saw it, he came to find her in the armory, where she was cleaning the rifle with the methodical attention she gave to things she cared about keeping. "You know what the clearance rate is for that course?" he asked. 62% historically, she said without looking up. "Better the last 2 years. You nervous?" She ran a cloth through the barrel. "Ask me when I'm on the range," she said. Oyalaran thought about that. "Fair enough," he said. He left her to it. She worked the cloth through again, slow and even, and outside the armory window the Carolina afternoon was going gold at the edges, the way it did in early fall when the light started getting serious about leaving. She thought about Aldrich, back in Sudbury, who'd watched her shoot when she was 13, and said there was something in her that went quiet when everything else got loud. She thought he'd gotten the observation right, but maybe not the meaning of it. It wasn't that everything else got loud. It was that some things got loud and she'd learned, slowly, in ranges and briefing rooms and ridgelines in the dark, that she could let them. She could let them be exactly as loud as they were, without flinching, without adjusting, without needing them to be any different than what they were. And then she could work. That was the thing. That had always been the thing.